today. Our topic is repaving the ancient Silk Road. Before I start, if I could, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Louder. That's the first time in my life I've ever been told to be louder. Wow. Okay, can you now hear me? Yes, excellent, thank you. Before we start, actually, my name is Deborah Biber. I'm the Chief Executive of the Pacific Basin Economic Council based out of Hong Kong, but it's a membership organization of business leaders around the 21 economies of APEC and beyond. So that's what I do for my day job. A big thank you. We're missing a couple of our panelists, but the point of today's session and all these dialogue sessions is that this is a moderated conversation. So we have some guest speakers who are experts in their field, but really this is a discussion with all of you. So if you see a seat without a name to it, please come and join us at the table, because then it's much more inclusive and much easier for conversation and dialogue. So those in the back row, or any of the back rows, can come to the table. Come and sit where there's a space. Be part of that conversation. Thank you very much. I'm not going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to get them to introduce themselves with sort of 2 minutes, no more than, because we're running late on this session because of the opening ceremony. I'm very keen to keep to time if we can, but also keen to ensure that we have a robust dialogue today together. So thank you. So our topic is repaving the ancient Silk Road, and as you can see from your programs, it says China is actively developing a new Silk Road, a beltway of roads and connecting development hubs, road and sea hubs, actually. Some routes traverse fragile ecosystems, others interact with multi-ethnic groups. The question is how to maintain sustainability while developing growth potential. How can potential resistance be overcome? So we're talking basically about infrastructure in every sense of that word. So I'd like to start, Dennis, let's start with you. Dennis Bondeville, if you could just say a few words about who you are and your background.
Yes, with pleasure. My name is Denis Bondeville. I'm the former Chief Executive Officer of the French Railways for Europe. So we built some tons of steel and concrete all over Europe to make high-speed trains, and now I'm doing the same thing in a convenient and clever way in Vietnam for the infrastructure projects, for transportation, and a little bit about energies too. And this is from my presentation. You want me to go on?
Yeah, I want you to.
Okay, so the topic this morning is about the new Silk Road that can talk to Westerners as Easterners in the room and everybody. I would just like to stress out one thing about the problem that can arise with transportation. The World Wildlife Fund issued a recommendation against the project because it's a project which is involving 64 different countries. The corridors are in the living places of 265 endangered species, 81 of them being in critical situation and 39 being in extinction danger. My only concern is that there is no official map of the new Silk Road, so nobody knows exactly where the new roads will be. So instead of just seeing a threat, can we see perhaps the new opportunities of such a huge project? Let me figure out something. Today, to make Shanghai to Rotterdam, and it exists, there is a train who does this. It takes 3 weeks. For sea transportation, 1 month. The road transportation is the fastest one, 2 weeks, but of course, the smallest amount of freight being transported is by road. So improvement is definitely on the land. Is it realistic to make high-speed train going from Shanghai to Rotterdam? Definitely not. I made a small calculation to see the price that could cost such a link between the continents. I arrived at more than $3 trillion. How to have an economical, realistic way of financing such a thing? There is no way to do it. So we must focus on what is realistic today. As I said, there is an example of train that exists that links China to Holland today. It took about 4 weeks to go for that huge train, very big train, more than 55 wagons carrying freight. And another small calculation I've made with some friends was to see the amount of time required to transport things. And we had the surprise to discover that 45% of the time and the cost of transportation was not to roll over the rails, but to wait at the borders because of the customs, immigration, police controls. So we can talk about infrastructure requirements. Some lines exist. We must improve them, of course. But when you reach 45% of your time waiting at a border, then the problem is more human than technical. Secondly, my reflection about this is about financement. How can we finance such a huge, incredible, and marvelous project? Really, for me, it's a marvelous project. I will say why in 1 minute if I still have the time. In Vietnam, we have seen a true example on how not to cope with the international money institutions, which is the private-public partnerships. Countries own lands. Countries have the right of use and the right of usage and transfer of lands. And what is going on in Vietnam is the public-private partnership is in effective situation today. So when the government wants to have a highway in Vietnam, they can call the private sector and not paying by money, but paying by the right of use and operation for contracts of 10, 15, 20 years, just like the way in Western Europe we have built the highways, by concessions. So instead of just expecting money from institutions, having new loans that the countries will not be able to pay or at an incredible price, then there is the partnership between the private sectors and the institutions locally wishing to have infrastructures. This is a solution which is in effect today. And thank you, Debbie, for reminding us that the main topic is not infrastructure, but what is the threat on the planet that such a transport can do. We can think on a clever way, on the way to install new infrastructures in the world. Let me take just a small example. If you know Côte d'Azur in France, between Marseille and Nice, wonderful country. First of all, there was a road. Then, at the beginning of the 20th century, we installed railways. Today, as the Côte d'Azur is tucked between mountains and the sea, there is no room to make additional roads and no room to make high-speed train. There will never be a train going at 500 kilometers per hour between Marseille and Nice because we had not the chance to think about the way to build it. Today's projects across the world of the new Silk Road give us the opportunity to think about the way we must organize the transportation. Let me confess something. There is no green transportation in the world. Transportation is roaring engines, vibrations, noise, tons of things rolling very, very fast or flying in the air. So we must think of the way to improve the conception we have. As an example, we have seen some examples in South America and in China of having a mixture of highways and railroads. It's very easy. You have 2 lanes in a railroad, in a highway. Instead of doing a 5 meters wide platform between them, make one which is 10 meters wide and put the train between the 2 lanes of the highways. So the footprint of your transportation system is divided by 4, which is huge. So One Belt, One Road and the new Silk Road is a way not to put in danger spaces. I will not speak about multi-ethnic things, but when I see a map on which the road could go through Iran, Iraq and Syria, I have some doubts of the feasibility of it for the next 20 years. But on the other roads, we have a way to think about a new way to make transports, that's for sure, and a new way to have exchanges between the West and East in a respect of what is existing, not because the technology exists, but because we have to be more clever and more aware of what we are doing when we pour steel and concrete on the ground.
Thank you, Dennis, very much. Much food for thought, and we'll come back to your suggestions and recommendations in a moment. Dimitri, yes, if you'd like to introduce yourself and then talk to the topic.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dmitry Belousov, and I come from Ukraine. I represent Global Transformation Platform, which aims to realize the economic potential of Ukraine by ensuring the sustainable deal flow to Ukraine, of course. And we co-hosted the Horasis China meeting a month ago in Ukraine. So I will be specifically talking about the role that Ukraine can have within the new rebuilt Silk Road. And I was really happy to hear that phrase from Dennis saying that there's no official map for Silk Road yet. And once again, I totally agree that it gives a lot of opportunities specifically to Ukraine. And why? First, because Ukraine can be a huge logistical hub for those commodities and products coming from Asia to Europe. The potential is huge there because we have 35 airports in Ukraine. Of course, only 12 are functioning, but anyways, I'm talking in terms of potential. Then, of course, we have 12 seaports in Ukraine. Another thing is that definitely the transportation system is underdeveloped in Ukraine. And once again, getting back to what Dennis said, there's a potential here because given the investment to our country, we can develop the transportation system that would connect Asia to Europe. Once again, Ukraine already has trade agreements with European Union and Canada. So this is a chance to provide the gate for Asian products to Europe by setting the joint ventures in Ukraine and adding value there. Talking specifically to Ukraine potential of having a trade with Vietnam, well, to me, this is something we were discussing previously. To me, in some areas, Ukraine and Vietnam look very similar. Why? Because of a growing number of educated people, specifically in engineering and specifically in IT. So currently, what Ukraine can provide to Vietnam specifically is the help of constructing the power plants here. And of course, providing the technical experience and expertise that Ukraine has. Don't forget that in Soviet Union, Ukraine was the Silicon Valley of Soviet Union. So we think that we can exploit that huge potential and become that link between Asia and Europe. That's 2 minutes, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitry. France. France, you want to?
Good evening, good morning, everyone. My name is Franz, and I will be representing Asia Commerce Network. I will be talking more on the private sectors and about the impacts of Belt and Road, especially in Asian and Indonesia, because our company itself has a footprint in 5 countries in Asian. So we actually become one of the beneficiaries in Belt and Road. So what is my opinion on the Belt and Road here is actually quite positive. Let's talk about the Indonesia first. Being the 4th most populous country in the world actually has made Indonesia supposed to be one of the biggest market in the world. But that is not the fact as it is now. Because why? Because we have a huge problem in our infrastructures. And along the way, we also have the anti-Chinese history dating back in our history before. So we know that China has been one of our most biggest suppliers in Indonesia, but since we have the history, a lot of our governments are being quite reluctant in receiving the beneficiary of Belt and Road in the first place. However, since the current president take over, we estimate we have around estimate budget of 355 billion for developing the infrastructures in Indonesia, which makes sense if we want to get Indonesia to be the biggest market in Asian first. Right now it's still Singapore, but we are catching up by being the fastest growth in GDP. But what does it need for the government to be able to successfully develop the infrastructures needed is 355 billion is something that cannot be completed by our government state-owned enterprise only. So that's where the private sectors came in. And even though when the private sectors came in, it won't be enough. That's why the Belt and Road initiatives, finally our government decided to take over and receive the Belt and Road initiatives from last year and this year. And we have overtake like high rail, subway developments, and then industrial parks, around 23 billion in development already going. But what are the threats? Basically, this is very interesting. Everyone been saying that, the Belt and Roads initiatives will give a lot of burdens in the countries. But as I see it now, in Indonesia, becoming the beneficiary of we call it here the maritime road, is actually a very good thing. Because why? Because if we want to accelerate the infrastructure, we really need to have the capital flowing in. As of the private sectors, it's actually very interesting because in Indonesia, we have a lot of private sectors in trading, and then having this more connected, better relations with China is actually beneficial for us because at the same time, the government wants to block a lot of the imports. But by having this Belt and Road, there will be our governments will be opening much more relationship with the trading in China. So that will be my opinion, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Simon Hopkins.
Whoops. Thank you very much for inviting me to attend Horasis. It's a great honor and very nice to see so many people in the room. I have always been fascinated by Asia. I'm a Brit. Like a lot of British people, I decided to orientate my life and professional career towards living and working in Asia. I was captivated by the fact that my family many years ago were trading in Singapore in the 1900s. My uncle was on the first relief ship into Japan with the British Merchant Navy after the terrible events of the atomic bombs. And I have worked for HSBC and Nomura in my professional life, although for the last 20 years I've been running my own company, which is now called Milltrust International Group. On that journey, I ended up marrying a Korean woman. I will be the last white man in the Hopkins family to walk the earth. My kids are half Korean, and I'm an internationalist and a globalist, and delighted to say so. While the rest of the world has been navel-gazing over its regional issues, in the UK we're preoccupied with Brexit and nothing else. The European Union is equally preoccupied with Brexit. In the United States we have this ghastly fellow Donald Trump in the White House, and Trump is clearly retreating from the global scene and making the vision of globalism and internationalism less of a reality. So who are the people that are doing things? Well, you can't ignore the fact that China has embarked on the biggest project of internationalization in its history. China is not known for internationalization. It's a nation where 90% of the population believe that they belong to the same ethnic group, the Han. They're not particularly sympathetic, and I don't think they're particularly good at integrating, although Chinese people are, of course, all over the world doing business. They're not great integrators. But nonetheless, they have embarked on this outbound investment crusade, and it is an incredible journey. It's not only about infrastructure in the form of ports and railroads, it's also about technology. I am the token Guilo sitting on the board of CITIC's One Belt, One Road Fund. That's a significant pool of Chinese money. It's only Chinese LPs who are invested into the structure from the mainland, not from Hong Kong. And that invests into businesses. It invests into businesses that are in technology, in telecommunications, in logistics, in data management. So it's not simply about the harder side of investing into the BRI or the One Belt, One Road initiative. There is also a lot of capital coming out of China into other aspects of this topic. Are they doing it with sensitivity? Are they doing it with the cultural sensitivities that would make this something to be welcomed by all of the countries that are set to engage with the One Belt, One Road? Things are coming out now, I think, which are somewhat worrying. And maybe not only in terms of the fragile ecosystem, but also the sensitivity of the Chinese government to making the people who will be part of this huge design feel inclusive and who are going to benefit without trampling over their cultural sensitivities and placing them in the invidious position where they're loaded with huge amounts of debt, is one of the great topics that I hope that we'll address during the course of this conversation.
Thank you, Simon. So several issues have been raised which are not usually thought of in conjunction with the Belt and Road, and that is the ecosystems that it traverses, both from a maritime point of view and also from a road point of view. Dennis mentioned there were 65 endangered species of wildlife, of animals along the Belt and Road. In fact, there's a whole section of what is proposed as the road link that is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there's portions of it in India that are on the waiting list for UNESCO approval as well. So we have some key issues, not the least of which is what Simon mentioned, which is the sort of Han Chinese domination from a cultural point of view along the road, and the perception of that, I should say, which is distressing and ill regarded. So I think that we should, what I'd like to do, or I will do, not like to do, will do, is to open the conversation up based on what you've heard and see if there are any more contributions before we start getting into a dialogue. Is there anyone else that would like to say anything at this stage? Yes, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. My name is Peter Brimble and I work in Yangon, Myanmar. And I guess one issue which hasn't been mentioned that much already is the potential role of very large Chinese operations operating in countries that may not yet have standards that, well, let's say that we'd hope would happen with that kind of investment. In Myanmar, for example, there's no question that the Chinese government is using the Belt and Road hook to gain additional contracts for Chinese, especially engineering companies in various projects around the country. And that leads to a system of, it compromises all the good practices for awarding contracts, and the government seems to feel not much choice, especially given the present situation. But I think that whole issue, in Cambodia you could talk more, in Malaysia, actually it's interesting that Mahathir has made some very key measures of how this is becoming almost neo-colonialism from China. But I think that whole impact on the bidding process, in Myanmar the story was that there was a contract being offered to be involved in, let's say, new city development in Yangon. And one Chinese company, which is called CCCC, which was actually blacklisted by ADB for about 10 years, bid on that project and won the project because of some dealing which was going on with regard to a major part of the Belt and Road to build a railway line from China down to the coast in Rakhine State. And I think this is a really huge part of the whole picture of the Belt and Road project. Thank you.
On that, of course, is the displacement of a whole population from Rakhine State, which, you know, word has it, is because of the desire to have a port into the Indian Ocean. So, point well raised.
Actually, Debbie, I'm not sure about that one. I mean, there are many issues about the displaced population in Myanmar. The port is in a very different part of the state than where that thing goes down. But yeah, it's certainly part of the chemistry in that state.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Harukata Takenaka. I teach political science in National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. And I was in geopolitics section yesterday here, and we kind of discussed the BRI as well in that session. And I have 2 points. One is about the port. The port is, the major concern for these ports, which are built with the Chinese assistance, is that in the countries in Indian Ocean, the country is facing in Indian Ocean is that, I mean, as I think many people are aware of, is that they may be turned into military for military use. Right? That's one, and that's my one comment. And the question I have is about the potential for belt. See, it's one road, one belt, and it's confusing. One road is this is really maritime transportation, and belt is a series of infrastructure developed to improve the land, because road sounds like road, but it's really a maritime transportation. And belt is a set of railways and roads for the land transportation. And when we hear many stories about, I have a question about the potential for development of this belt in its capacity for transportations, because you can, I mean, you have enormous. It's easy to carry loads with the ships, and it's very cheap and it's economical. But I wonder how that, like building like railroads or roads, can really improve the transportation between Asia and Europe. I mean, even could it surpass the capacities of like maritime transportation? Because when we hear many stories about like sending cargoes on railroads from the inland China through the Kazakhstan and then to Europe, but I wonder if we can put a lot of money into developing these railroads or the roads, but after developing such infrastructure, that kind of infrastructure really has a potential to compete with this maritime transportation. And if you have any thoughts on that, I would like to hear your comments.
Yes, I have an idea about that. I don't have figures in mind, but first of all, the roads itself, trucks, it's not extensible. You cannot put billions of trucks in the road to go to Europe and go back to China, that's for sure. So this is not the most interesting thing, and the hazards of transport are very high, okay? Which is not the case in rail and maritime roads. The other thing is that only with the question of physical infrastructures, of harboring, trains, you can put as many trains as you want on a railway. It exists in Australia some trains that are more than 5 kilometers long. Okay? So basically, if you have to transport a huge amount of goods from east to west and vice versa, maybe one day Europe will export to China, we don't know, then you can multiply the number of trains. So far today, the security reasons make that you cannot put more than 2 trains without 15 minutes of delay between 2 convoys. Okay, so when you have the railways, it's almost infinite, the number of freights you can have. Maritime transport has a problem, which is the harbor. Today, what is the most important cause of pollution in Canada? Nobody knows that. It's the fact that cargoes coming from Shanghai and from the Chinese coast arriving in Canada have to wait longer and longer time on deep sea because there is no room enough to welcome them to unload the cargo. Okay? So we can multiply the number of freights and the number of boats able to make the transportation, but we cannot multiply the number of huge ports. And this is the main difference between rail and maritime transports, for me. Oh yes, definitely, definitely. There is one logic which is quite easy. Rotterdam in Holland is one of the biggest ports in the world. And the capacity of Rotterdam is not linked on the ground, meaning that the transportation on rail is quite infinite. What is expected is the number of cargoes that can unload the cargo at the same time, because it's geographically limited, and also you need cranes, you need small trains to vehicle the cargoes between the cargo itself, the boat itself, and the loading platforms. That's the weak link, so to say.
But are you saying that Chinese rail transport is competitive or not?
Today, rail transport is not competitive, except in some countries of Europe. In some countries only. Why? Because the connection, it's not a technical question, it's an organization question. For example, the certification of rolling stocks in Europe is different from a country to another, which is stupid, okay, because it's European Union. But when you go eastern, you have the same problem. And inside China, there is some problems of certification, safety standards between the regions that makes that the time of transport is longer than what it should be, just for administrative reasons. Only that. So it's competitive within countries. On an international ways, we have a lot of work to do before it will be competitive.
I guess, may I?
Yep.
May I? Thank you. Just to sort of be slightly controversial, and as we're in Vietnam where it's a very hot topic, the insidious nature of China's expansion across the region, whether it's through militarizing islands which are of questionable territorial validity, and building trains where you can move people into places like Xinjiang and Tibet to move not necessarily troops, but populations, and dilute the ethnic nature of those places and put people in who represent the apparatchik of the state to control people and change their cultural identity. Appears, and I don't want to, I don't want to be a strong advocate of this, but I want to represent what I've seen. It appears to be something of a strategy of China, and I'm in the business of actually growing and shipping large amounts of agricultural product. My business as an investment company invests pension fund money from the UK, from South Africa. We represent the government of Botswana, some very strange international investors from both the developed and the developing world who are investing in growing food and fiber. And a lot of this goes into China. And arguably China recognizes that social stability in the country is dependent on feeding its people, and it needs to ensure that it has control over the sea lanes of the South China Sea and so forth, because they're enormously important for bringing food into the country. So you could argue that it's worrying that there are territorial disputes with the Philippines, with Vietnam and so forth, but the Chinese would see it differently. They would see it not necessarily as militarization. They don't have a history of sort of expanding out and taking over other countries as other parts of the world do. But they do want to ensure their territorial integrity and their social harmony within their country, and that requires military might and this perhaps somewhat insidious control of people in places that frankly Chinese didn't really care about in the past, because they were tens of thousands of miles away from the east coast where 90% of the Han Chinese reside. So, but that's changed, and the Belt and Road may well be contributing, and so I think it certainly is contributing to this shift in the Chinese international policy, if you like.
First gentleman here.
My name is Rupen Roy. I'm from India. the old Silk Road could not have been imagined without India. So one wonders how the new Silk Road can be possible without the active participation of India. Now, what is India's position? We in India believe in many gods and many languages and diversity. And the moment you say one belt, one road, our antenna goes up and we think of one Phuc, one Got, and one Führer. So I think if we do not have and you're seeing what's happening in Sri Lanka, what is happening in Pakistan, because these are balance sheet problems. You just can't say that I'll build a huge convention center, I'll give you free money, 30 years you don't have to repay, but that asset has to repay. There has to be ROI on that. So, and Malaysia has given a huge pushback. And the same thing, it's basically, is it economically viable? Enough has been talked about cultural sensitivity, military designs. I'm not going to go into that. Now, India has also announced what is called the Sagarmala project, which is necklace of the sea. So there has to be an ability, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, these countries cannot be disconnected from a network of communication, digital communication or physical communication. So therefore, a way must be found of resurrecting the old Silk Route rather than trying to say that this is the route, my way or highway. So I think there is an issue of not being able to convince and include into the framework the key players without which this is not going to be a meaningful venture. Thank you.
You raised excellent points. Thank you. Yes, gentleman down there.
My name's John Kidd, Aston Business School. Let me offer one or two statistical backgrounds. A very big modern container ship carries 20,000 containers. Dumping them at port is 20,000 trucks. A hell of a lot of trucks on the road. And in terms of old-fashioned standards for railways, which, because of the way they were built at one time, a train would take 160 containers. I know nowadays you have multiple engines, increasing the length of a train, and you have double stacking of containers, but nevertheless, from ship to land, you have to somehow transfer from 20,000 in a small box, a ship, onto a rather long length of road or railway. That said, shipping is remarkably efficient in terms of energy consumption, but it is more consumptive than steel wheels on steel rail once the engine and railway system gets moving. There is acceleration and so forth. However, as was just mentioned, the railway systems have very inefficient braking, which is why you need a long distance between engines, between trains, in order just to stop. And the engine drivers cannot see the next train, as we do when we drive. We can tailgate, we hope to stop and not hit the car in front of us. Railway drivers can't do that, so you need a large space. The fantasy world that is the future is one in which there is no oil. In 2001, there was a lot of theory about passing peak oil. In other words, half the oil that had ever been found was gone, and there was no more. After that time, shale oils and shale gases were discovered, and America now is pumping vast quantities of shale oil into the world markets. This is fine, but oil is a finite resource. At some point, oil will cease. Well, it won't actually. The price will go up rapidly, and there will be oil left underground, which we cannot afford to pump because it will be too expensive. 98% of freight in the world is carried by oil, in ships or by trucks, and a few tons by electrical rail. So we've got to move in this fantasy world of the future to an electrical propulsion system. And in my world, my fantasy, that is maglev. The Pudong, Shanghai overhead levitating train that runs extremely quickly, not because we want speed for freight, but because of passing a lot of freight quickly along one line. And global systems are easy to create with present technology. It's a political problem and it's an electrical supply problem. But if none of that is done and begun now, which perhaps is what China is going towards gradually, but undeclared, we will not have the ability to mine, refine, and build the freight systems that we all need, whether it's for agricultural product or hard stuff or whatever. The world will run into disaster quickly once oil is not there.
Dennis, do you have anything to say?
I've said earlier that there is no green transportation. It doesn't exist. And if oil, I agree with the gentleman that oil is not the future. But if we want to have freight possibilities and transport possibilities, because that goes also for the people, we have to put more research and development funds to find something else to do. Tesla, Mr. Musk made some huge investment for electrostatic trains and tube trains, new way of transportation. Electricity is not the solution either, how to produce electricity. We can make power plants with rice straws today, but it will not provide enough electricity to move high-speed trains. Definitely not. France had a huge investment in nuclear plants. This is a dead-end technology because it's too dangerous very far. So today we don't have a solution. I don't know the solution at all. But I think that if we want to provide enough energy to be able to transport, again, more and more people and more freight tons, we have also to invest a lot into research to find new solutions. And in the fantasy world that our friend was talking about, kilometers still make 1,000 meters. So we still have to find a way to produce enough energy with new way of transportation, with less wheels on rails perhaps, and less consumption of energy to make engine works. But today, I don't know these technologies. They do not exist. I would like to have some good news to give you, but I don't.
I'll just give you food for thought in that I believe that there are technologies that over the course of the next decade will alter the landscape entirely. And I think there's every possibility that it'll be China that come up with these new technologies before we in the West adopt them. One of the problems is there is obviously tremendous sensitivity around science that comes out of the United States and the Western world, and that is being developed in China, and very little cross-border interaction. But in the national laboratories in the United States, there has been the development of a technology called thorium. Thorium technology is a safe nuclear technology. It is using a very common element, which is one of the most commonly abundantly found resources in the world. It's number 17 in the periodic table, thorium. And it will be, and you can read a book about this. There's a fascinating book which came out a year or two ago called Superfuel, which is written by a fellow called Richard Martin. I urge you to read it. I think it's a visionary book, but it is telling you what is actually happening at the, currently. Arriva and other great French companies, leaders in the nuclear world, are aware of this, but it is going to require financing. And unfortunately, we are behind the Chinese in this. It's not talked about widely because there's a lot of sensitivity around the words like enrichment, nuclear, and so on, because we associate it with weaponization. But thorium is an entirely different proposition to the use of uranium. So just throwing that into the mix if you're interested in the evolution of new energy.
Fascinating.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Lou Marinoff from the City College of New York. I'm a philosopher and therefore have no expertise to contribute, but to this I would like to ask a question, though, of the experts in the House, if I may. It seems as though the conversation has moved from the Silk Route to energy. They're not unrelated, but the focus has shifted. There were some geostrategic and militaristic and other kinds of implications that were, I think, more relevant. The question of food came up, so my question is about that. And I'm just asking. Firstly, I'll just preface this as speaking as a ghastly American. I don't think we're running out of fossil fuel. We've never been close to running out of fossil fuel. There's plenty more where it came from. And I mean, the sun will one day turn into a supernova and incinerate us all. That's several billion years down the road, and we'll still have fossil fuels then, I dare say. So that's not the problem. But my question is whether China can feed itself, and this is the part of the larger global picture surely is China's interests in mineral rights in Africa and China's investments in South America. I mean, China is everywhere, and I don't, as a conspiracy theorist, worry about that, but I do worry about China feeding itself. So my question to the experts is how much of this is really food related? Is China a net importer of food or a net exporter of food? I don't know. Please enlighten us.
Well, one of the things that I can contribute is a fact that 5 years ago, China didn't import any beef, and last year it imported 5 million metric tons of beef. What is happening in China is people's dietary habits are changing. People are urbanizing, they're moving into cities, and they're changing the way they consume. And they're moving to a more high-protein Western-style diet. And that has implications for the agricultural land of the world, because we need more of it, because we make meat out of plant matter. We grow soybeans, or we graze cows, or we feed them corn in the United States, and then we fatten them up and we try to sell them to the international marketplace, of which China has become a hugely important one. And unfortunately, it takes 5 kg of grain to produce 1 kg of lamb, 7 kg of grain to produce 1 kg of beef. Probably about 1-to-1 in terms of fish and chicken, which is why when I was a kid, it was a treat to have some fish on Friday. Once a week, a man would come and knock on the door from Grimsby, the port, and try and sell us fish. And we would buy a nice piece of fish, and that was very expensive. I remember my mother being conscious of it being a very expensive thing. Now, of course, we eat tilapia, and there's vast amounts of it being produced here in Vietnam in farms. And fish has become the most efficient way of producing protein for our increasingly protein-demanding diet.
Notwithstanding also the environmental impact of beef producing in the world as well. That has some role to play here too.
It does.
Although beef is being produced in a petri dish, I understand as well. Any other questions or comments, contributions to this discussion? Sorry, I had my microphone off. Any other contributions or input to this discussion? We've sort of strayed away from the original intent of the session, which was the impact on communities and societies along the maritime and road rail links, that the grand vision of the Chinese to in one belt, one road. Is there any contribution from any of our speakers or anyone in the room about these issues, if they see them as troubling or difficult in any way?
Madam Chairman, I'd like to, my name is Penning Wong. I'm a chairman of NGO. I'm a Chinese Canadian. So I want to give 2 comments, and I'd like to invite people for the feedback. I don't know Belt and Road that well, but I notice a lot of people in China feel Belt and Road is the government spending a lot of money to help the developing country to develop, rather than spending money to improve the standard of living for people within China. Now today I hear some criticism towards China, and I want to just, as an open discussion, I have no comment, I have no suggestions. Number one, I visited Bolivia and Ecuador recently. Those countries, they said their standard of living is getting worse and worse because they export agricultural products, and very few countries, America is not buying from them. Because it's a small country, 10 million people, they have to import industrial products like a fax machine. And America sells fax machine to them at very high price. So they are looking for a country like a China would help them to build a railroad, to build the highways, and then they can sell agricultural product to China at a premium, and they can import cheap China's industrial products. So they are looking for China to help them out. So a lot of developing countries, they say, please extend Belt and Road to our region. Okay. Now, you look at the development of China, not too long ago, there are 1.3 billion poor people in China. But quickly, China will have only 30 million poor people and a lot of middle class, 400, 500 million middle class people. The reason for the quick development is they borrow money from World Bank, from Japan, and they use the money wisely to develop. So I'm saying is, people criticize, you make the poor country have acquired debt. But we all know, if I'm poor, the bank will not loan me money. No one will help me out. If China loan them the money and build a roadway for them, to build a highway, to build a port in a developing nation, it's pain and suffering. Many people died. You go through the harsh environment. I don't think the Americans want to do it, the British want to do it, or European want to do it. So I'm just saying, sometimes it may or may not be fair to criticize China, to loan the money at very low interest, take the risk of not paying back and take the risk of people where can walk away from the contract. And to build a railroad, build a highway, it's very difficult, because a lot of Chinese workers, they have to cook their own meal, and they have to know waters, they have slept in a camp for 3 months, So I'm saying it's a thankless job, making peanuts and getting criticism. So I want to invite everybody for your comment. It's another way to look at it. Don't judge. It's easy to criticize, but would you want to do this thankless job? Yes.
I think you raised the same issue yesterday. No, I think it's okay to, for any country to provide assistance and help the developing countries to develop infrastructure or to reduce poverty. But in case of China, it's like sometimes their intention is not so clear. And as I've said, the case of Sri Lankan port of Hambon Tota has become so famous, but they lent a loan to Sri Lanka for I don't know, and the Sri Lankan government could not pay back the money, so that the Sri Lankan government decided to loan this port for 99 years, right? And this port, people have, I have heard stories from the people who have visited this port, like this, that this port cannot be economically, cannot sustain itself. So many people wonder this might be eventually used as a port for Chinese Navy. And so, the sea lanes, that means the sea lanes in the Indian Ocean may be under threat from China. I don't think that will happen in short term, but that may be an eventual vision of hidden purposes of these loans, and I think the Indians are also very much concerned that they feel as if they are surrounded by these ports helped by the built with the Chinese assistance. So I think what we should do is that other countries should engage with China and make clear about their intentions, and also even there are possibilities of potential military threat posed by China. Other countries have enough potentials to be able to cope with that kind of potential threat. Then I think it's the Chinese will be aware of the possible responses from the other countries, so that they will not do something dangerous. So I think that kind of mutual assurance, and I think it's necessary.
I will have a comment here as well, because in Ukraine we have quite different problems with dealing with Chinese companies. One of them is that actually there are several infrastructural contracts that are being signed, that are signed actually between the government and Chinese companies, and the problem is they never come to life. By whatever reason is there, but they just do not happen without the contract is signed. This is A. B, the other thing is that normally, quite often, Ukrainian companies, especially engineering companies, are afraid to deal with Chinese, because they find that signing the contract or any type of agreement with Chinese is the reason Chinese can steal the technology from Ukraine. And the third thing is, if you probably heard, there is no open land market in Ukraine. So one of the key reasons, one of the key opponents of the open land market in Ukraine is one of the presidential candidates in Ukraine, who's Tymoshenko. And one of the reasons she's speaking to people, being a populist party, and being against open land market, is that if you open the market, Chinese would buy it out totally, completely. So the three reasons that Ukrainian people are very cautious in dealing with China right now. It's slightly different from what you're speaking about because though we are a developing country, we have technologies in place.
You have raised a very valid issue. The way you have presented it is that if there is a poor country like Ecuador, which I have visited, which does not have money, which needs infrastructure, and Americans are supplying fax machines at a high price, probably made in China also, because their manufacturing is not that great. Why would not they accept free money or low-cost money from China to build their infrastructure? And why is it that while this is a thankless job that the Chinese people are coming, building the infrastructure, giving them money, and then getting a bad name? That this is very ungrateful and not a very good thing to do. But I think each country is a sovereign nation. Whether I accept your money or not, whether I accept your workers or not, whether I accept your infrastructure or not, maybe you have excess capacity. This happened in the earlier times also. American aid came with the condition that you have to use American workers. I remember once in one, I will not name that country, I was going to do work in Bangladesh, and they said, why didn't you fly our airlines? And I said, then if I have to fly from Calcutta to Dhaka, I have to fly via some other European or US city. So I think it is important for every sovereign nation like Sri Lanka or Malaysia or India. India is of course not accepting any aid from China. And, or any other country, Ecuador or Venezuela. These independent nations, elected government must make this determination. It is not for somebody else sitting somewhere else to decide what is good for my people. And from a global standpoint, it is necessary to engage with each other, be respectful of each other, be working together as a cooperative body, rather than saying, this is the one belt and this is the one road.
May I add 2 more points?
Just very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. First, I agree with everybody. What I'm trying to say is, people saying China is a threat, but I don't, I'm overseas Chinese. I don't think that is a threat, because once China get rich, you buy more agricultural product from the world. If China get rich, they do business with you. So I don't think China have any intention, want to invite any, because you look at China, it's different from a colonial power. If China get rich, China get rich. They just become a tourist. They just buying customer from you. I don't think China want to, but humbly I'm saying, we are not own colonial powers. Those are old-fashioned. So that's comment number 1. Comment number 2, I'm saying is, I agree with that gentleman, is, like Ukraine. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. You can decide, I want to do business with Korea, with Japan, or with America. Having China come along is just one more supplier. You have to compete. They have to compete for your business. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. On that note, we're getting very close to, thank you, sorry. We're getting very close to the end of the session. And I really don't want us to leave on the note of a China bashing session, or to denounce One Belt, One Road as a sort of subliminal takeover of sovereign nations, because I don't believe it. I don't believe it anyway. But I would like our core speakers just to end with their thoughts, one quick thought on what concerns them in the next, say, 12 months about these issues, the issues we're here to discuss, and what they see as progress in the next 12 months. Dmitry, we'll start with you.
Well, of course, I would talk specifically more about Ukraine being a potential part of the Silk Road. So, as Dennis was saying, one of the issues within the Silk Road is that a lot of trains need to wait on the customs. And once again, getting back to Ukraine, one of the key reasons that Ukraine is underdeveloped in terms of the potential is the corrupted customs and different procedures that require a lot of waiting there. So one of the key initiatives the government has right now, Ukrainian government, is to reduce the waiting time and to reduce the barriers for the goods coming into Ukraine and coming out of Ukraine. So this is the part of the strategy for 2019, one of the key strategies of Ukrainian government. So hopefully, well, definitely next year is going to be very difficult in terms of political life in Ukraine, because we have presidential election and then parliamentary election. But still, the progress would be the reduction of the barriers that we have in terms of the customs procedures here. That's my point.
Dennis.
My conclusion is that One Belt, One Road is not only a threat, even if China has been quite quoted today, but don't forget that India also, our friend from India talked, don't forget that India launched an initiative of infrastructure and communications for the southern part of the continent, which is quite interesting. So my point of view is that whatever the reason is to make more business or to have military base or whatever it is, these initiatives are the first opportunity in the history of mankind to have a collaboration between the whole planet to improve things and not only see our own small immediate profit of building a road or a sea or a port or whatever it is. So we have to seize that opportunity to think, to create things all together, and let's not just see threats, let's see the good it can provide too.
Thank you. France.
Well, I think it's really my belief that any country can have a really win-win solution as long as each country has very selective considerations on what projects that should be have. Within our government in Indonesia, even though the Belt and Road Initiatives is focusing on the infrastructures, but I never see anything that really connects infrastructures between China and Indonesia. I mean, the developments has so far been involving around like the development of energy power plants and high-speed railroad within Indonesia. So there's nothing that is really connecting between Indonesia and China. So I think our government really understand that for the win-win solution, it just needs to go for the really selective projects, and we should have really good collaboration for the Belt and Road Initiatives. That's it. Thank you.
Simon.
I think China has been clearly a game changer. I think a lot of people see it as the golden teat, and everybody wants to suckle on it. The sensitivity of China in engaging with countries around the world is very important. We live in a very peculiar geopolitical landscape where the world, particularly in this part of the world, is populated by very populist leaders. I don't know if I'd call them strong men, but people like Duterte. Who would have ever thought Mahathir would be back? The military junta in Thailand, and obviously on an international scale, Putin and Trump, all very strong, patriotic, potentially nationalistic sort of leaders, arguably a product of a world where you need to have a strong man to represent the interests of your country. But as we all know, potentially fraught with risk, because these people can use power for the wrong reasons and not necessarily in the interest of their people. But I think China does represent 40% plus of global GDP. It's only going to increase. We need to engage with China. I'm very surprised and very ashamed that there aren't more Europeans and British round the table at this event. It's been noticeably absent, and I think the world needs to be engaging with China in order to do business. That's probably sufficient from me. Thank you very much.
So much. First of all, thank you very much to all of you for participating and being round this table. This is, as I said at the beginning, a dialogue session for the very reason that we all do need to talk to each other. I think one of the big ideas that has come out of, and there are many ideas that have come out of today, but one of the big ideas is the real requirement for business to work with government to reduce barriers to trade and to work on sectors such as services and beyond the border trade initiatives. Xi Jinping has called for another major Belt and Road Conference in May in China, the second of such a gathering, to which he will invite or has invited prime ministers and presidents to attend. And it's at that level that sovereign nations need to stake their claim to the potential benefit of those nations, as well as the Chinese. Again, just to leave you with the thought that wherever you roam, it is extremely important to take care of the societies and the environment that you find yourself in, and those must be considerations in the development of your businesses and of your projects. And I leave you with that note, and I am now releasing you for lunch. So thank you. Could you please join me in thanking our speakers today? Thank you all.